can't see me. Well, one day when I was in the classroom, the subject of the day was Jim Crow. When the teacher asked what it was, most of the students said they didn't know. I wonder why, 'cause you don't care about my history. I can't see me. Let's have these hard conversations.
Since people are coming in, Facebook is coming on.
Right.
We got to fight that good fight because we have a right to be heard and seen.
Right. Of course. I hate when people do stuff like that.
Right now, I can't see me. I can't see me.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming in from the waiting room. While we're waiting to get started, if you could just mute yourself temporarily until we get started. Thank you so much. So good to see everybody's face.
Racism because it makes you uncomfortable. But what about me? I can't see who I am in these lessons. I can't see me.
And you're listening to the wonderful sounds of Stephanie Woodford. We'll tell you more about her as we proceed.
About the racist blocks in our education. We gotta fight that good fight because we have a right to be heard and seen. 'Cause right now, I can't see me. I can't see me, 'cause I can't see me. I can't see me. No. I can't see me. What about my education? I can't see me. Oh no, yeah. I can't see me.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Thor Keselowski. I'm going to be helping facilitate tonight's evening. Tonight's event, the virtual presentation, I would love to be in person with all of you, but we're gonna make Zoom exciting tonight, is a workshop on the systemic racism that exists in education. And tonight, this workshop is being brought to you by the Honeycutt Foundation. We have Dr. Veronica Honeycutt, who's the host of tonight's event. And tonight, we have the great Miss Olivia Herriford as our speaker, and the incredible Dr. Joe Canton. Both of them are doctors and very experienced in the area of education and racism. And we're going to get into a lot of very, very interesting information that we hope will be enlightening for you and stir you to think about how our education system is set up. And so, Edgar, if you can move on to the next slide. As I mentioned, Dr. Honeycutt will go over Stephanie's background, but the music you heard was created for this evening's event by Stephanie Woodford. She's an amazing vocalist and songwriter, and she just makes exceptional music and melody and stirs your heart. So I hope you enjoyed that beginning intro. She was made special for tonight's workshop. This is her background. Dr. Honeycutt, I want to turn it over to Dr. Honeycutt to introduce both the speaker and our facilitator and tell you a little bit more about Stephanie.
All right, thank you very much, Thor. Thor, and welcome to each and every one of you. It's wonderful to have you with us. Today, as Thor indicated, we are discussing systemic racism in education. And I'm going to make my general comments brief because Dr. Canton will cover all of the information that you need to know about this subject. And in conversation with Dr. Olivia Herriford, you're going to get a lot of wonderful information. And do remember that you can put your questions in the chat and we will make sure that your questions are asked. You will be muted. You need to understand that. And if you have any information that you would like us to respond to, that is Dr. Olivia Herriford, Dr. Canton, or me, just, put our contact information will be listed and posted in the chat. So, and we will follow through on what you indicate to us that you would like us to discuss. And I want you to understand that we are paying attention to what you say in the chat, because the last two presentations that we did were subjects that you asked us to talk about. And I want to thank you for that. I want to encourage you to please give us feedback. Please let us know what you want to discuss. All right. So thank you very much for doing that. We want this to be meaningful to you. So in terms of this systemic racism in education, Blacks were denied access to educational opportunities in the North and in the South, and their segregated schools were underfunded and under-resourced. The lack of expenditures in education for Black students existed for at least 40 years in the South. Blacks in the North had challenges to getting an education as well. So what are the effects of systemic racism in education in America today? It was my privilege to introduce our moderator, Dr. Joe Canton, and our guest speaker, Dr. Olivia Herriford, and they will discuss these issues. Dr. Canton, and when you have two brilliant people who are heading up this endeavor, I'm trying to be succinct, but at the same time, they have done so much that it is necessary for me to call out their wonderful accomplishments. Dr. Joe Canton is, in short, the word I use for him most of the time is brilliant. He is an accomplished consultant, an expert in various fields, former director of the S.R. Martin College Preparatory School, CEO of the Fellowship Academy, longtime instructor at various colleges and universities, the CEO and owner of Canton Associates. He has a master's degree from Occidental College in Urban Studies and a doctorate in Comparative Studies from UC Irvine. He is also a fellow Choral Fellow. And I would be remiss if I did not indicate that he has had a number of great positions, but one which was in which he was very outstanding, and they paid attention to him because they had to, because he had the good sense to be able to help them with their mission, was his role as the Director of Personnel and Labor Relations for the city of San Bernardino. Now, in terms of, and of course, Dr. Canton will be moderating tonight. Now, Dr. Olivia Herriford, our esteemed guest speaker, has an extensive career in tech spanning over 40 years. She has held leadership roles in computer hardware and software industry, a long consulting career in IT project management, organization health and effectiveness, and in diversity and inclusion. And you can see on your screen some of this information. I'm just pulling out the highlights for you. She has and is supporting tech workforce development programs and industry partnerships at California community colleges and community-based organizations. She leads workshops on managing implicit bias to support her clients and colleagues in their commitment to facing systemic racism in education and tech. She's been an educator since 2002 and currently is contributing faculty at Walden University, where she mentors students developing doctoral dissertations. She's a serial volunteer, and that's not C-E-R-E-A-L, folks. That's S-E-R-I-A-L, volunteer. She's on so many advisory boards, it would take me another hour to list them all. However, I can say Dr. Olivia and I serve as legacy members of PWIC, Powerful Women, International Connections, a marvelous and wonderful organization. Dr. Herriford was born in Compton, California. And by the way, Dr. Canton, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, was born in Alabama and attended segregated schools So there's no excuse, people. Now I'm going to have to digress. There's no excuse for you not getting an education wherever you come from. Okay. You know, don't make me start. Okay. Because it's just so wonderful to have these two people here. You know, you have one who got through segregated schools, and you've got another one who got through and keeps going. Okay. Not that Dr. Joe doesn't, but it is indeed my pleasure to welcome Dr. Herriford to this event as our guest speaker, and to Dr. Canton as our moderator. Joe, I'm handing this over to you right now.
Thank you, Dr. Honeycutt. And I'm very grateful to be on a great program. This is your fourth program on a subject that's critical in terms of thought today, in terms of a new idea toward paradigm shifts. These programs that's been presented are activist oriented. We first of all want you to realize how serious a question when we're facing the issues of race, and how you find it on television today being discussed over and over again. And we were wondering in this process, what programs could we do to incite those individuals to take action, to think in terms of an action, becoming a thought person in this process. So as a result of that, we're asking you to individually clarify and define your individual responsibilities for solving racism in education. When that answers the question, what can I do? What will you do? The next is you should begin by establishing personal goals and developing a comfort zone in discussing racism and education. And particularly as we understand this particular question is so pervasive and have been around a long time. And by the way, no one has found an answer so far. We want to clarify what critical race theory is and why it is so important in our educational system. This is a new nuance as far as discussing this issue, and it has raised the ire of a number of folks, political individuals in particular. And so last, you should be thinking about how you determine actions to lessen racism in the school system in order to provide a safe zone for our youth. So it's very important that you think in terms of what it is you can do. Many times we're thinking about what others can do, but the question is, what can you do and will do in solving this age-long problem? Next. So, as I move to the next slide, I want you to understand that in discussing this subject, you should begin to have a great appreciation for history. A great historian by the name of Henry Clark indicates that history is a blueprint, and it's a blueprint of a history of what people have done. It tells you where they've been, and it also gives you an indication of where they're going. So, in the African terms of the Afghan or the Akan people in Africa, they have a saying that Sankofa is important because they symbolize it with a bird that looks backwards and at the same time moving forward, and in its beak it carries an egg of goals and lessons that you've learned from the past. And it's very important that we understand that. So I'm going to quickly move through a step into history. And we're talking 1607, the English landed at Jamestown, Virginia. Of course, there's arguments and debates about that particular date as to whether it happened or didn't happen. In 1619, we find that the first Africans that were imported as slaves. Now remember, 1619, we're saying Africans, not Negroes, not colored people, not black folks, not Afro-Americans. But Africans, they were Africans. So these folk went through a number of changes in their designation, but it was not by their determination. In 1776, we had the Declaration of Independence, where this country became free from King James. So, as we look at 1865, the end of the Civil War, some folks argue whether it was about slavery or was it about the institution of economics. Was it an economic issue? However, the slave was part of the economic process. As you know, as a capitalist, you have to have land, labor, capital in terms of those three things. In other words, you got to have some land, you got to have capital to be in charge of production, and you got to have labor. So the Civil War showed that this labor was free. In 1968, which was the last Civil Rights Act, guaranteed African Americans full citizenship rights. Now think about that. There have been a number of civil rights cases, or civil rights laws. In 1866, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we had a Civil Rights Act directly setting up the Freeman's Bureau, and that was what are you going to do with the folks who are newly freed as slaves? I find that racism is in the DNA of the American culture, and we have a history of institutional systemic racism in the development of the education system. So racial bias in the history of American education dates all the way back to 1800s. So every group that have populated these shores have had the experience of white supremacy and the system of white supremacy. For instance, you find the indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced into boarding schools. Now, these are the people that Columbus said he discovered. These are the people who were taken to boarding schools, the Carlisle School, for example, and then the education was used to assimilate them forcibly into white culture. Chinese American children was barred from going to public schools and was segregated into Chinese-only schools. So that explains when you see the Chinese schools. Latinos face the same fate as the Chinese in this practice of segregation. Latinos were granted under judge ruling that they were of white descent and therefore above other minorities. That was a judge's ruling on that case. And when you look at the southern states where I resided, they instituted laws against African Americans, completely obstructing their ability to get an education for historical reasons. In other words, you had to control that. One way of controlling control of a people is to keep them ignorant and to keep them where they cannot function. It was illegal for an African American to learn how to read and write. To teach a slave to read or write, that you came under the penalty of death for you and the person that was being taught. A system was established to prevent slave revolts. Then we move on down the line to where we have Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is famous for a minstrel show, but these laws were set up to maintain slavery. In 1877, was a separate but equal doctrine, where it was stated in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. Prior to that, you found that Judge Taney, who was a Supreme Court justice, indicated that blacks had no rights that any respecting white should observe. In 1954, we had the Board of Education decisions that separate was inherently unequal. Now, progress and change was met with violence, and American schools became a war zone. We have images of students like Ruby Bridges being escorted by United States Marshals to and from school. And in my hometown, I was there when Arthurine Lucy integrated the University of Alabama, and they called out the National Guard, and Judge Wallace at that time said, "Segregation today and forever," and he stood in the door defending what he called states' rights. In 1964, Civil Rights Act would provide federal funding without regard to racial discrimination. And so during the 60s to most of the 1960s, where we had quite a bit of social unrest and challenges to the system, and now we're at 2021, and the question is, where are we now? So what I hope you got from that quick diversion through history, that you will find that this question is of long standing. And tonight, this evening, you're going to hear from an outstanding educator and a person who, yes, out of Compton, okay, who has experienced and shown not only the tenacity, but demonstrates her outstanding ability to be a professional in an area that generally is not populated by people of color, black or otherwise. But she come to us with a plethora of information and knowledge, and will share with share with us her experiences. So I'm going to begin our discussion by having Dr. Olivia Herriford talk to us about her background and some of the issues that she thinks are important as we pursue this subject. Dr. Herriford.
Great. Hey, well, thank you for the very flattering introduction. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic. And I'm very fortunate to be in a position right now where I've had experience across sectors and work where this all comes together. And when Dr. Honeycutt asked me to do this talk, at first I was a little reluctant because I don't consider myself an expert in public education. I've only been in it for 12 years. But people like y'all have been in it forever. So I'm flattered and really honored to be here and share my perspective, which comes from my own educational journey, the years that I spent as a pioneering Black woman in the technology industry, coming out of that experience with a passion for change, to be able to do whatever I could to see more people that look like me be successful in these areas, in the areas of tech and other STEM opportunities. So, and now, as I said, 12 years working in the community college system here in California. So I'm really excited to share my perspectives today.
Great.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, and even though most experts don't consider themselves experts, but they are, whether they like it or not, and certainly you have the knowledge that as we pursue this subject, because this is a subject that is so important that the technologists, the IT people have made a great emphasis on STEM. That is looking at this question of science, technology, and engineering and math and science, this whole thing. But here you are, you spent over a number of years in this field, and you are not the people we find in the newspaper. So talk to us about that. Like how did you go about getting your science background in school? And you might describe the school in Compton, because a lot of folks may not understand the environment because it's been stereotyped, but I want you to talk about it.
Great. We'll start with my story then, okay?
Yes.
As was mentioned, I grew up in Compton in a single parent household, raised by my father. I lost my mother very young, and I was the oldest, so I had to take on a lot of the responsibilities of being the oldest, kind of like the mom, because I lost my mother at 7. My father was a janitor with an 8th grade education. So one of the things that he constantly stressed was education. And I took that to heart. So I did well in school. But when it came time to making a decision about what I wanted to do, I was torn. I had been played violin from the ages of 9 to 18, and I wanted to do music. But at the same time, I was just an incredible science fiction nut. I read about robots, and I had this stirring concern at 13 years old that, oh my God, the world is going to be able to be taken over by technology, and there'll be no more humanity involved. And so I said, I'm going to go into tech so that I can be some of that humanity. This is a 13-year-old thinking. So I was thinking of both things. And so my father, however, was very concerned about music relative to my ability to get a job. And so when I talked to my counselors, they said, well, yeah, maybe you should just be a teacher. And I said, but I think I can do so much more than that. And I had a friend whose brother was going to school to be an aerospace engineer. And I just said, at a whim, I just said, I want to do that. And my counselors tried to talk me out of it because I would be going to a school that they couldn't check. It was an engineering school. And in those days, they would rather see kids go to Cal State University or one of their UCs or whatever. But I wanted to go to an engineering school. And at the time, in the 60s, when I was applying, there was only a couple of schools, engineering schools, that would accept women. I applied to Caltech, no. I applied to MIT, no. Not accepting women. This was in the mid-60s. Okay. So I ended up at Northrop University to begin to pursue a aerospace engineering degree. I was very fortunate to have an internship with IBM during the summer, so that kind of steered me toward computer science. So I have an early computer science degree. I got my computer science degree, took me 5 years in 1973. And I got to tell you, the college experience, going to an engineering school of 2,500 students with only 10 women and 1 Black woman, actually prepared me for what I was about to get into, because some of the racism and discouragement and unfairness that I experienced at Norfolk University prepared me actually for the hostility that I was going to face when I got into the work world. And I experienced it for a couple of years, where I was working with white engineers who just could not stand that here was a young Black girl coming in to teach them something about what they did. I have to admit that I said, no, I can't do this. So I went to my company and I got moved over. I just hightailed it away from engineering as fast as I could. It was just causing me too much stress. And then I got into a really good position where people appreciated who I was as far as my personal skills. And from then on, I worked for the same company, but in a different area, and I moved up into management. We primarily were pretty typical tech companies like they are today, selling products, selling services, introducing new ideas, teaching, etc. So it was my personal skills that led to management opportunities. I became a manager in my company at 26. And I was in management all the way to the point where I went out on my own. And the whole time, it's really been the kind of situation where, you know, I got used to seeing myself passed over for promotions. I got used to some of the, you know, reference to me as a gal to my face. Just things like that. You know, you develop a hard skin, but at the same time, I also wanted to be human. And because again, that's always been a passion since 13. And I think that's what carried me through. And I, established a pretty good network where I was able to go out and start my own consulting firm. I went back to school to get my MBA in the early 90s. And then I decided that I was interested in leadership. And I wanted to, understand more about that because that's what I enjoy doing. And then I ended up with a doctorate in management and organizational leadership. And when I got to the point where I started doing a lot of service work, as Dr. V pointed out, I'm a serial volunteer. And I wanted to figure out how can I bring all this together, my work, my experience, what I've learned, and my passions. And I found this opportunity working with, in the community college systems here in California, which is one of our most diverse populations, in the country, where I could see if I could have an impact on, getting more women and Black and Latino into these lucrative opportunities in tech. So that's where I am right now. But I've had a lot of experience in watching how the system works understanding why, even though we have this very diverse student population, that they're not succeeding. I see the passion, I see the desire in these students, but the whole institutional racism, the whole institutional, fog has really, is really the culprit, here.
Dr. Herford, you as you talk about your experience, you are a person that have always given back to the community, and as have served as a mentor to a number of our children, would you talk about? I could see how they could be inspired by you, but what are some of the challenges that you meet and getting them more inspired and motivated to become engineers into the high tech area?
Well, I think one of the challenges, I think, with getting our students of color into STEM, okay, is that it starts very early with the constant decline of math and science skills, but at the same time, that's not because of them. So, for example, let me say this. I think one of the things that we often hear about, and we have to stop using this term, is achievement gap. Okay, the achievement gap is a deficit term. Okay, it puts the onus on the student. In other words, the reason that the students are the reason that they're failing. And so when we talk about low math scores and the achievement gap, we have to look at the system and why are our kids in K-12, not not succeeding in the classes that they need to move into STEM. Okay. So one of the things that I've observed is that there's nothing to engage them. In other words, I'll tell you a story. One of my very good friends is an 8th grade science teacher, and she was and she's a white woman. We're friends because we were in tech. We both came out of tech into education, and so she was assigning a group project about a law of motion. And she had signed them to pair off. And she said there was one Black boy who he was very unengaged all the time and, really didn't like to work in these projects. But the great thing about her was that she said, okay, she let him alone for a while. And then she watched him. And then she went over and says, why don't you that's good. Watch, see what the others are doing. And then she watched him and for what was getting his attention. And she found that little aha, and she went over and adjusted the lesson so that he could continue to pursue that interest. Even though he wasn't exactly following the directions, she found his interest. And the story is, she tells me later that just completely turned him around. She found, so I think with that's one of the reasons why our students don't continue to pursue, because we're not pursue these studies, because our teachers are just not prepared to, many of our teachers, I want to say many of our teachers are just not prepared on how to engage and support Black students and with consideration for their own experiences.
Well, as you talk about this motivational factor and expectation, and a teacher who had the interest to find out what the student's strength was and taught from that. But very seldom do you find many teachers that have that kind of perspective in a multicultural environment to be that observant, to understand and come to that point where you can take the strength of the child to teach them various concepts. But as you talked about this law of motion, the physics law of motion, the problem solving aspect of that, would you touch on that a little bit? Because I think, I went to a school where the folks gave us word problems, And the folks used to hate the word problem, but the word problem was say if you drove 10 miles an hour and you got to go 100 miles, how long would it take you to get there? Time and distance. But they taught that. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, thank you for asking about that, because when I used to, well, I still do very frequently. I will come and talk to students of color at events and places. They it's always great. They love seeing somebody that looks like them talk about their experience. And one of the things I always try to remind them is that your experience, particularly those students who have very difficult life situations, where they are, dealing with issues of shelter and food and the surroundings in their communities. And, one of the things that I tell those students is that you got up this morning, and when you put your feet on the ground, there are a lot of challenges between you getting out of your bed, get out of the community, and then to come in and sit in this classroom that a lot of your teachers don't understand. Okay. And you have, because you have dealt with those trials and tribulations, you have some of the characteristics such as resilience, dependability, okay, creativity, persistence, grit. Okay. And those are the things you're never going to learn sitting in a classroom. Those come from life experiences. And a lot of times the students will take those kind of experiences for granted and feel that that's something they want to leave behind. Okay. I mean, I think about, what my life had not been like if I didn't have so much responsibility at an early age. Okay. And most of us, when we grew up, those of my age, we had lots of responsibility. It didn't matter whether you were a single parent or, had both parents. you had a lot. So those are the kind of things that I urge my mentees, my students, when I'm talking to, those define who you are, and don't take those for granted, because that shows you how you had to solve problems right in your own home. You had to solve problems in your life. And if you can learn to be comfortable with doing that, comfortable with making mistakes sometimes, comfortable in knowing that things will work out if you work hard. I mean, those are differentiators, not only in school, but when you come out of school.
So Dr. Herriford, in terms of how it seems that racism as a system seems so immutable. Matter of fact, it kind of reminds me of this virus, that COVID-19. You think you've been immunized, but at the same time, you get a new strand and it seems to come in the system in a different way. Like, for example, politically, you hear folks talk about voter suppression, when it's nothing more than you trying to stop folks from voting by developing and drawing lines to ensure that you have some power or continue to have power. But it seems to sometimes, for me, I don't think I would have been successful if not understanding racism as a system. For instance, I could be sitting in the classroom and I knew and understood that the white student was getting a different message than I was getting in terms of the subject. And what they were getting, as one educational philosopher said, that they was getting a message of how to rule, and we was getting a lesson on how to be ruled. So I don't know how true that is, some folks, but I just wonder, because I hear folks say, "Well, Dr. Cannon, I've never been discriminated against." And I'm always asking what planet they grew up on. Or what was their secret? I always ask that question. What was your secret? Because I grew up in it in Alabama when I was a kid. So that's where I got my PhD in white supremacy in Alabama, because I grew up in it. I grew up in a sharecropper's home with no carpet on the floor, no running water inside, an outhouse, a real outhouse, outhouse is not like the in-house, okay? With the nice faucets and all that stuff. So I grew up in the tin-top roof. I knew Santa Claus wasn't coming there. I would have heard him if he did. So the exposure in terms of in an environment where not only was it legally set up and understood that racism, and they didn't have to say it, but it was in law. It was embedded in the law. So the question comes in mind, what do you tell young people today about this intrinsic notion of race?
I really think we need to help our students understand what institutional racism is and how they're encountering it right here in our public schools. Okay. I mean, I look at how I mentioned earlier, it's been 12 years and I've been looking at some of the policies and practices, and it's just so obvious, but it's so entrenched and unconscious that, even the people deeply embedded in it and affected by it don't see it. So, for example, I mentioned that idea of the terminology achievement gap and the onus that it puts on the student. Well, I had a colleague tell me 10 years ago, and this is what raised my attention to it. Our system teaches to the gap. It teaches to the gap. It creates the gap. For example, I talked earlier, you asked me about STEM, and one of the issues and challenges that our students have is the low math and science grade, the low math and English grades they get. Well, we're perpetuating that because and I'll give you an example, in the community colleges, before you enroll in the California community colleges, you have to take a math and English assessment that quote unquote determines if you're ready to start to take college level English and math. Across the board, that practice disproportionately affected our students of color. And they would end up languishing in what they call remedial classes for sometimes over a year, sometimes 18 months before they can even take a class they could get credit for. So it was 2014, 2015, there was a law passed that said, in California, that said that if a student can show that they earned a B in their English and math classes, or they can show their overall GPA, you put them into the college class and you give them the support to make them successful. You talked about, and that's the difference. See, what we typically don't get in those classes is the support that make them successful. Those white kids could come to that class with the same bad English and math scores, but that teacher's going to help them because they feel comfortable. They know how to better help those students, but not our students. So anyway, AB 705 was put into law almost 7 years ago. Out of 116 California community colleges, only 3 have fully implemented it.
Wow,
that's a problem. That's a problem.
You're pointing to a very important point in terms of looking at this system. And of course, a gentleman by the name of Neely Fuller says that if you don't understand racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else will confuse you. That's a quote that he gives in terms of looking at this whole notion of a system that operates to maintain the kind of structure. So reform, when you think of reform in the system, we've seen a lot of reform, the notions of reform. Folks said, oh, you need vouchers. Folks says you need different kinds of school structures. Now, I go back to where folks didn't think about all of that. They just said you got to know how to read, write, do arithmetic, and get along with people. Those are the three basic principles. And they didn't have special education. Everybody was special. So if you was a little slow, the folks that you stayed in that class until you could get it, and you didn't hear the psychologist say, well, that'll lower his self-esteem. Well, if he can't read and write, his esteem gonna be more than low. He's not gonna be able to function. He or she's not gonna be able to function in the society. So even though those were basic, and I'm just amazed at how a school. Now I do understand the notion of having role models, because in my school I did see math teachers who looked like me, who could work out a quadratic equation, a person who could do algebraic equations and break it down. I still remember the law of axioms, and I'm 79. Dr. Straight Talk tell me to stop talking about how old I am. But you learned in that environment. I learned, and I compare my high school experience in the segregated South to my college experience in California. I went from an AA degree to a PhD with less than 5 Black teachers. Less than 5. And my question is, when, of course, I was a little older going to college, speaking to the age question that I've heard so often, which I don't think age has anything to do with folks who has an open mind and want to learn. And California used to have an education plan for that as well. But I guess my concern is that when you look at how intractable this system seemed to be, and the individual would say, what can I do to make a change? Now, we know what the politicians have suggested. They've suggested a number of gimmicks. They even, and back in the day, in the 60s, they thought busing was going to do something. We found that folks would just burn the bus up and find a new school. So I guess when you look at this, and it seems to be hard, but I like the way you're giving back to the community, where you're helping our young people navigate the system. And that's commendable. I know you're going to write a book about this too as well, right? I'm always asking these experts who have solved a number of these problems to write books, because I think it's important to show folks the way to navigate through the system and not get discouraged, not be disappointed, because those are the things that knock you down. Or you got to have a strong spiritual connection in order to go through this process as well, else you'll be totally destroyed. That's my personal thought. So let me ask you this, and I think then we'll move on and let Dr. Hutter come in here. But in the long run, from this point on, as we see the reaction to changes that we see globally taking place, the pandemic has brought a tremendous pressure on the current way we educate our children. And as you know, in the technology realm, most of 38% of African Americans own computers. So that when they did distance learning in that way, we lost a lot of children. Now the question is, will you think we're going to regain those children back because it puts such pressure on a problem that existed long before the pandemic?
Well, you're right. One of the things that's happening in the community colleges overall in California here is that since the pandemic, obviously, a lot of enrollment is way down. However, the frightening part of that is enrollment, this percentage of enrollment of Black students is a lot large, that we're losing. It's not even. In other words, there are more Black students not coming back to school than white students after the pandemic. And so there's a real urgency of understanding how we deal with that. One of the things that, I tend to be an optimist. One of the things that when I started this work around diversity in our career education programs and in our jobs, they asked me to take a look at what are some of the barriers. How can we deal with some of the barriers of our students successfully completing our tech programs and getting jobs? And it was so overwhelming to me, Joe, that's when I first understood back. This was like in 2012, 2013. I said, this is systemic. I started talking about that back then, right? And so the only way that we can deal with big issues like that is to try to take what I call an affirmative approach. What's working? Why are some of our students succeeding? And across the board, it was a teacher that made the difference. It was their experience in the classroom.
Yes.
Right? So one of the things that we began to look at was the hiring practices, the look and feel of in other words, and we knew that already. I mean, we don't have enough, as you mentioned in your experience, we don't have enough faculty that look like our students. And the hiring practices in our system don't encourage that. The whole idea of, tenure and hiring committees and, so many of these schools financially, most of their faculty are adjuncts. And it's sad because the adjuncts are usually the most passionate because they're the folk that are doing the work because they want to, not because that's how they make their living. Right. So I really think that some of the changes have to come around taking a look at what's working. Let's look at our hiring practices so we can get, more students more teachers of color. The other thing we talked about, just to share with you my ideas about some of the systemic, problems, and it goes back to what you were saying that, one of the quotes that, when I was thinking about this problem is, I don't know if you know who W. Edward Deming was. He was the total quality manager. Yes. And, he has the quote that says, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets.
Yes.
Okay? I mean, so that's what I teach into the gaps, and this system is so broken that way. So that while we start to look at adjusting these policies around hiring and assessments, we have to start integrating into that things that are working. Let's bring in more faculty of color. Let's bring in programs where we, like the things that I'm doing, where we're getting, students exposure to, people that they can relate to and resonate with, and talk about, what it's like out there and what you're gonna have to, deal with, and give them the tools to deal with it.
Let's talk for a minute about Mr. Demings. Of course, the Japanese hired him when their products were failing. Matter of fact, to buy a Japanese product, folks thought, well, that's a joke.
Yeah, right.
But he went there and showed them not only quality control, but we had a system that was designing products for planned obsolescence. In other words, that you're supposed to turn over a refrigerator in so many years. But he went there and showed them how to take quality control and put it into actual practice and research that most businesses at that time would not apply. So I just find it interesting that there was a genius on how to make a system work to produce a desired outcome. But on the other hand, we're finding here a system that has dire consequences on the people who engage it.
Yeah. I mean, you have to wonder why, California has one of the biggest economies in the world, but we have some of the worst public schools in the country. I mean, it's almost shameful. And, you know, I think the thing is that it all got started, obviously, again, talking a little bit about history, Proposition 13 in 78, right? Where,
Yes.
you know, we shifted from, you know, a lot of the funding to education coming from property tax to the general fund, right? So whenever the economy gets dicey or the general fund gets low, the schools suffer. And unfortunately, you know, I mean, I live in Walnut Creek. I've been in Walnut Creek since 1980, and believe me, I moved out here in 1980 because it was cheaper. It's kind of flipped now, but anyway, you know what? I see all of these signs around about, you know, raising money for this school and doing, you know, all in affluent communities. We can deal with that gap, but not in our communities, not in communities, underserved communities. And so that is why those schools are just so much worse than those. And so that's another issue. And, you know, who's making the decisions about the general fund? You know, it's not the schools or the teachers. It's a decision that comes down. So, you know, it's dicey. You know, a lot of the work, for example, the work that I do on behalf of the Bay Area Community College Consortium, everything is grant funded. You're probably very familiar with that. So many positions and works and progress and you know, things that we're trying to get done are funded by grants that are maybe a year or two. Mm-hmm. So you get started with something, and if you don't get the continued funding, you can't continue it. So all of these wonderful programs about, you know, putting equity in action and, you know, implementing, for example, 705. Uh-huh. They have to be done by people who are funded by grants if you get the grants. So
let me ask you, you raised another point, and I did want to break in there because I know you was heading into a very important concept here. But this notion of community versus neighborhood. Now, a neighborhood and a community, I'm finding we had a neighborhood where I lived in Alabama. You know, the neighborhood says that you could be reared by your neighbor. It meant that also you could leave your house open, even though everybody didn't have anything, you didn't have anything, but no one break into your house. So you could see, but it was a community where folks watched over the product of the children. In other words, the senior citizens would always telling you, boy, you got to do right. Go to school, get your education. I remember that one. Don't be like me. But there was lessons coming from a body of people who said, look, we're not going to stand for things in our community that's not protecting our children. Now, I think, and maybe I'm idealistic about it, that until the community come together and say we've had enough, and that we may, at some point, say, develop our own schools. We had them before. So maybe the answer lie in some things we did in the past that we don't apply today. Just maybe. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I mean, I grew up my time in Compton was right at the time where actually the west side of Compton was Black and the east side of Compton was white. These were tract homes that were built after the war, Korean War, and, you know, everybody was buying them. But when the Blacks started moving into Compton, white flight began. But all that to say is that in the early days of living in Compton, we had a neighborhood. And the rule was on our street that no kid should be outside when the street lights came on. Because if someone saw that you were, they were gonna send you home and call your dad to say, I just sent Simone home. They called me Simone. I just sent her home, you know. So anyway, but that, you know, what happens is, so people ask what happened, you know, and what comes to mind, and I'm diverging a bit from education, but just our systemic racism in general. What comes to mind is something I heard in a clip that James Baldwin say, is that over time, when these neighborhoods change, and they're changing because of poverty, of inability to sustain a means of living, and this is not only about income and prosperity, but also health care, the mental health issues, etc. These people become desperate, and when you become desperate, you don't like yourself, and you don't like anything. You lose respect for yourself, and you lose respect for everything around. That comes out of desperation. It's poverty and lack of access and resources, challenges that turn these what used to be wonderful neighborhoods into places where people are afraid to walk around.
Well, you didn't diverge too much from what we're talking about, because if you're talking about racism and white supremacy as a system, you're talking about the parts of a system that come together to achieve a certain end. So if your economics, for example, is part of the components of the system. Education is part of the system. Entertainment is part of the system. Religion is part of the system. War is part of the system. So all of these pieces pull together when you think of it as a system. But compartmentalization is very difficult because they all work together to achieve the same thing.
I know.
And
Our students are desperate. Our students they're coming in with lack of respect for themselves, and they're just showing up because someone told them that to do. And that's what we have to work on. I mean, I worked in the Bayview for quite a while, on the board of the Bayview Hunters Point Y. And there was one thing that we used to always talk about when we're trying to uplift and help folk. And that was, we got to deal with the whole child. And by that, we meant that we're not just serving the kids in this community. We have to uplift and serve the entire family. We have to really take a look at how do we support the whole child. And I really think that a lot of the programs, even at the community college level, but some of the things that I'm hearing are working very well, is that we're getting, more parents and guardians involved.
Yes.
Getting them to come back to school, Yes. So I really, that's my thought on it. I think we have to look at the whole. In fact, Dr. Joe, when we first talked, you brought my attention to the what was the report? It was in
it was the Coleman's report that was done in 1960.
Yeah, and what? And the interesting thing about that, I did some research on that, and that what came out at me was that he shocked people because he said, no, the achievement issue is more dependent upon the student's background, their life situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and that's what I was mentioning before, when I'm talking to the students that I'm mentoring, that I'm talking to, that I'm trying to be a role model for, is I say to remember that, your circumstances can be an asset. And I think what our education system needs to recognize is that the situation around the student is also where we need to provide support and put their learning into context based on their experience.
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised, because I didn't realize I was poor until I was in my sociology class.
Same here.
If folks I thought everybody had holes in the shoes. But there I learned that poverty is a state of mind as well. So that gets you through a number of things. So Dr. Honeycutt, would you want to segue over with your questions or?
Yes, I'm going to try to ask. Thank you very much, Dr. O and Dr. Canton. What a wonderful discussion, an excellent discussion. I do believe that there are some questions, and I'm going to ask Mary to ask questions as they appear in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Honeycutt. Yes, I do have a few questions, Dr. Olivia. What role does politics play in this issue?
Well, okay. There's politics in the education system, and there's obviously the overall politics. So I'll start with, the politics I see in the California public education. And I really think that, there are so many silos in our schools. You have the teachers and their union. You have administrators who are usually not unionized, and you have staff. And then within the academic departments, they are split between transfer, 4-year pathway, and then the vocational career pathway. And the problem with getting a lot of support for our students, so for example, one of the things that I tell students when they're trying to make a decision about or encouraging them to pursue STEM is that, you can do both. You can do both. And don't let those silos, because the thing is that the career education folk are going to say, well, if you want a job, this is going to get you work right away in 2 years. And then the academic side of the house is saying, no, you really got to go 4 years. So there's a politics of within the organization that don't make it easy for our students to make the right decisions. And then unfortunately, at the leadership level, at the administration level, it's a revolving door. So you cannot really affect change when you're only going to be in a position for 2 years. And that's also very political because, you have the boards and their issues, et cetera. On the macro level, I've always been leery of the policies that an approach to education that Betsy DeVos brought to that administration, because it seems to me, from my perspective, and like I said, I talk about this because I don't know a lot of the details, but it seems to me that prior administration really wanted to take as much money away as possible from public education. And they know, because they know that it's public education that our kids depend upon, right? And if you take that away, they're going to keep us in our place. They're going to keep us where they have us now. So I'm very leery when I hear vouchers and charter schools and things like that. I mean, some of them may work, but I'm distrustful.
Thank you. Excuse me. Another question is, excuse me, if you are not a teacher of color, what can you do to support the students of color each day?
Thank you for asking that question, because after that, after I came back after doing that research in 2013, that just basically depressed me about how systemic it was. I asked I got permission from the center that I work for to create a workshop for our faculty, most of them being, not of color, on how to engage with underrepresented students. And one of the, in my doctoral research, part of my doctoral research was on emotional intelligence. And I began to also do a lot of research on unconscious bias. And a lot of our white teachers are just unaware of some of the privilege, implicit bias that they have, embedded in unconsciously within their thinking. that they have to become aware of. How do they become aware of when they might be guilty of a microaggression? How do they, connect with the student and make them feel like they're respected and listened to? How do you show that you do care without, feeling like you might be giving someone special attention, or etc. So I think our teachers need more training on unconscious bias, understanding when they may be guilty of microaggressions, and that, as Dr. Joe mentioned, that they're treating some students differently than others. So I think, and there's a lot of that going on, by the way, that there's a lot now in our schools. A lot of that training is underway.
Thank you. Another question is, two questions in one. How do we get more people employed in upper echelon jobs and positions in tech companies? And why are the numbers of Black and other people of color leadership in these companies so low?
Networking, networking, networking. Okay. People hire who they know. And traditionally that's been people who look like them. However, there's that is changing as far as being comfortable with where you can show up, right? I mean, you can go to you can jump on LinkedIn and create networks in LinkedIn. You can there's lots of organizations that have student memberships, or people that are looking to already working and looking to advance. I am on the leadership team for an organization called the International Consortium of Minority Cybersecurity Professionals. Now I know you guys are hearing how hot and big an issue cybersecurity is. Mm-hmm. They need people. They don't care what color you are. That is a job right now that if you get the training, and now I'm working with organizations that will also take cyber interns, paid interns. So it's exposure. It's exposure. And I really think that over time, I'm starting to see, at least just in the networks where I'm seeing that, I'm meeting chief information security officers, Black CIOs and CISOs out there in tech. So I'm encouraged. It's still a long way to go, but I guess my point is, if you really want to get into tech these days, pick the areas where there's high demand and low supply.
Very true. Okay, another question I have for you. In regards to race and class segregation and its relationship to local school revenues, why do you think students in high poverty, racially segregated schools are not exposed to high quality curricula, high qualified teachers, or important social networks as often as students in wealthier, predominantly white schools?
If you're a brand new teacher coming out of school, you've passed all your CBEST, and you're a white teacher, white female teacher. Do you think she's want to teach at Willie Brown Middle or over here at Lafayette Middle? We are not, the thing is that two things happen. First of all, the schools are under-resourced, right? Now, I take that back. Willie Brown Middle is very, very resourced. That was just the first middle school that came to mind. But I think the thing is that, the teachers do not have the resources that will make sure that they're successful. They don't feel comfortable because they know it's going to be a lot more challenging with those students. And so we're not attracting good teachers to those schools. It's really kind of funny. I always have, pushback because with my academic colleagues, because I always tend to kind of remember my business experience comes through. That's why Deming came up, right?
Mhm.
Our funding model is across the board. It doesn't matter, the schools are funded by the butts in the seats, right? However, I know from business that people and performance comes from what's measured, right? So if you really, really, really want to improve the student performance in schools that have traditionally not done well, then you've got to invest in that.
Mhm.
Why should the funding model be the same in affluent communities versus not communities that are underserved? But that is just like heresy to mention that.
Mhm.
Yeah, mystery to me.
Okay, thank you. Is one answer to the systemic educational problem to have Black schools for Black students?
Yeah. Now, I just think that should be an option. I'm not saying they should all become segregated, but I'm saying, I've talked to, I went to like that small private engineering school, and I remember when I got out of college, and I, hanging out with Black friends, I was just so envious of my friends that went to HCBUs, to have had the experience of comfort and safety while I was going through a hard job of earning a bachelor's of science degree. Instead, I had to do it in a very stressful environment. And I really think that, their comparing the education that they got, sometimes better than the one I got. So I just think it should be an option, just like it is today, that students can choose to go to an HCBU. I think they should be able to choose to go to, public schools that are predominantly, like San Francisco has a lottery system. You could choose you wanted to go to a school where that there's going to be more students that look like your son or daughter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question I have is, how do we get more qualified Black, Latino, Asian, and other teachers and administrators of color in the educational systems?
That brings to mind about a week ago, I was reading that here in California, the Department of Education is eliminating some of the tests required for K-12 teachers. You have to, I think I know one of them is the CBEST, but I think there's two others.
Mm-hmm.
So that they believe by, minimizing the hoops, the test that a teacher has to, complete and earn to become a teacher may, offer more, get more, women of color, men of color as teachers. However, here's just like AB 705, it's meeting resistance.
Mm-hmm.
The whole intent of it is exactly why that person asked that question. We need to make sure that removing any barriers for those teachers, for those folk to become teachers. But immediately, the first thing was this uproar from, primarily, tenured faculty saying, oh, you're lowering standards again. What example does this show to our students that this teacher didn't have to take this particular test. That's the argument they use.
Mm-hmm.
It could be very valid to them. And maybe those people pushing back really don't get it, what they're trying to do. But see, that's been the issue with the system the whole time. They can push back and say, oh, standards and, that this isn't really gonna, in the long run, this isn't gonna really work very well. Our teachers aren't going to be as good as they should be, etc. But see, it's just another block. And the cool thing too, Dr. Joe, you asked about some of the changes that may be coming post, to education, recovering from the pandemic. There are a lot of people, parents who, after the experience of having to not homeschool, but do the lessons, for their students, that they were given to them for their kids. There are a lot of them that are saying, hey, I actually enjoyed that. Do you know that the application to become teachers is going up because of that? And now let's do, I'm sorry, I hate to use the words, let's do some affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody hates that word, term, but I think yeah, we need affirmative action. To those students that, those parents that now are thinking about becoming teachers, hey, if you are, a Black male or, a Latino mother, come on, we need you.
Thank you. That's amazing. Another question I have is, what are more systemic racism issues in education that need to be addressed and dismantled?
Well, I talked about the funding model. I talked about hiring. I talked about the silos. Let's talk a little bit about the gap, teaching to the gap. One of the things that we're starting to do is just remove achievement gap from our vocabulary. And, some people start to use the word opportunity gap, but the one that I was just recently, there's some work that's been done by some recent work that's been done by some Bay Area Black scholars. And they call it the, the schools have to deal with what they call the obligation gap.
Mm-hmm.
And the obligation gap is, was been created by our public education system. And what it is that it's a gap in what public schools as service institutions provide versus the actual needs of the student. And I keep going back to, the Coleman report, and that students all have individual needs based on their life circumstances. That's what, the Coleman report comes out, that's what continuing research is starting to understand. And so schools are starting to invest in what they call student services, but there's still a lot of, it almost seems like it's trial and error whether it's working or not. Mm-hmm. But I really think that we have to reshape the thinking around where the gap really exists, right? It's not about the failure of the institution to our students. It's about what that's coming back to what that institution is supposed to be doing. Read, rights, and citizenship. Reading, right, and citizenship, right? So that is, I think we have to work on that. And to do that, we need to get folk out of their silos, and we need some consistent leadership.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
It's a long haul. It's a long haul.
Another question is, how can we get teachers to know who their students are and use their students' skill sets to motivate them to be successful rather than them seeing them because of their race?
Well, that was the intent of the training that I wanted to do, that I was allowed to do, and in fact, I continue to do, just under the guise of unconscious bias. You cannot. You have to connect. You have to connect on a human basis. I think of the terms pedagogy and andragogy.
Mhm.
The root of those terms is lead the child, lead the man.
Mhm.
Teachers need to be leaders. What does that mean? Teachers need to be lead. You think of it as that if you had a team of people that was you wanted to support them and coach them and help them be successful with a common objective that they have. And the only way you're going to do that is to really connect with them individually as to how they show up in that group working together. Too many of our teachers want to treat, quote unquote, everybody equally, fairly. Well, you have to remember the platinum rule. You guys know what the platinum rule versus the golden rule is?
Mhm.
Platinum rule, golden rule says do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Mhm.
Platinum rule says do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And the only way that you're going to know that is to want to be curious about them. Our teachers need to be curious about our children, our kids. They need to really want to understand who they are. What is their worldview? Why did they show up 2 days late in a row? Do you even ask that question? Do you even want to know what they might be dealing with or the challenges that they have? If you don't show that kind of interest in your students, I don't care what color you are. I mean, there have been some bad teachers of color, right? But if you're not going to do that for your students, I don't know why you do what you do.
Amen. I have another question. What policy changes are needed to break down educational barriers?
Oh God, so you know what, I mentioned that I mentioned some broad areas already.
Mhm.
The funding models, okay, how we do assessments, how hiring practices, how we work together, across parts of the institution. And then under each one of those, there's multiple policies and et cetera that need to be addressed. But see, I still keep coming back to leadership. I mean, when you have somebody at the top that really wants to affect change and change the culture, then they will begin the work of surrounding themselves with people who are as good as or as better than they are, and talk about how to solve the problem and to engage people out of their silos to get them to feel like everybody has a role in this. And again, I'm coming from my private sector business perspective on that, but I've seen pockets. I've seen that work. For instance, the 3 schools that have implemented that new policy. I know of one of them, and I know the leadership that they have. They have excellent leadership.
Mhm.
And it's just like it's just like business. It's just like the country. When you've got just like the United States of America. You know, I just as a little side, I just finished listening to Barack Obama's A Promised Land.
Mm.
And it's amazing the problems he took on in 2009. Oh my God. It was the Great Recession, right? Everybody, I mean, you know, hey, I was even one of those people. I almost lost my home due to the recession. These are the kind of things that he took over. We would never, I mean, it was amazing. And he was a leader. He was a leader that was compassionate. He took everybody into account. He didn't have anybody that he excluded or whatever. And he worked with his enemies. He worked with people that wanted to see him fail. Why can't we have that kind of leadership in our public system, where you're running to resistance from entrenched entities, where you're running into challenges around funding, when you're losing your Black kids like crazy? We need somebody that's going to come in and you know, be that kind of leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I don't know where we're going to find it, but that's what we need.
Amen to that. I have two questions left, Dr. Olivia. One is, what measures do you believe need to be in place to enforce teachers going through retraining for the better solutions in teaching our children with dignity and pride for the better outcome for each individual?
You know, I am in the process right now of proposing to our regional consortia a plan for, I call, embedded equity. And what I mean by that is that every initiative, every project, every program should have some action aimed at equity. And not only defining it and integrating it in everything that we do, but also quantifiably measured. A lot of people feel you can't measure it. Yes, you can.
Mm-hmm.
Everything can be measured. But a lot of people resist being measured. And that's some of the challenges of that question, is that a lot of faculty, as soon as you want to start measuring them on the performance of their students, oh my God. Revolt.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what it would take. Now, I'm not saying, my proposal isn't saying that. My proposal is saying, we need, if you want to put equity in action, you have to measure it. And you have to actually have actions that have outcomes that can be measured. But, you know, again, I get this because I'm coming from a business standpoint. Anyway, yeah. So I think it's being measured. And my answer to that is being measured. Making folk accountable for the change they want to see, or the change that they commit to make happen.
Great. I have one last question. And this question is also for Dr. Joe, for each of you to answer. How can educators view culture, heritage, and race as a resource in teaching?
I'll let you go first, Dr.
Well, I think when you look at the role of the teacher and how important it is to serve in that role, and the ability to understand children, because I learned in my tenure with this school, Fellowship Academy, that everybody is not a teacher. There are, matter of fact, you will find very few teachers, the ones that can engage the student and involve them in the educational process and hold them to high expectation, but through the teaching process, achieve that goal. I'm not convinced there's a clear way of even testing to find out, because I don't think that the tests that they give, it may not, well, I don't think they may not be a true indicator of performance. Matter of fact, in many instances, tests have proven not to be an objective measurement of being related to the ability to perform the job of teaching. Now, maybe at some point we got to determine what are the necessary traits and skills that's necessary to be a good teacher. Now, I know I didn't go through where I had folks testing who were good teachers now, but the teacher that I had, first of all, they held me to high standards. They expected high expectations. I mean, there was not, I don't recall in my earlier development a teacher believing that I couldn't fly to the moon. And they taught that way. And they paid attention to me that way. So I can only base it on my experience, and I'm coming from, as the young people would say, back in the day. But I think those traits still today. Yes, ma'am.
Would you repeat the question for me?
Yes, let me get back to the question. Sorry. How can educators view culture, heritage, and race as a resource in teaching?
It's important.
Well, one of the things that did come out of the whole school integration was that there were white parents who believed that the exposure of their kids to different cultures was beneficial. And that is still kind of actually going on and more exemplified today. And because I hear, I've heard, mothers talking about when they're choosing their school, they want a school that is diverse. They want their children exposed to different cultures. And so teachers could do the same thing. Maybe they don't have as much diversity in their classes, but you can teach different cultures. Mm-hmm. You can teach different perspectives. It's fun, actually. I mean, there's a supporting organization called Facing Our History. It's a teachers organization, and a lot of it is about not only teaching, as Dr. Joe pointed out early, really embracing critical race theory, but also about teaching the cultures and backgrounds and how systemic racism has impacted us all. So I think the teachers will be surprised. Some of them I've said in some of these meetings. I mean, it's eye-opening for them, the opportunities for engaging our systems, our students, when you include that in the curriculum.
Thank you both for answering that. And those are all the questions I have right now. I do encourage everyone to please fill out the survey. We have the SurveyMonkey link in the chat. And Thor, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Thank you, Mary. Dr. Herriford, Dr. Kenton, this is just extraordinary. Understanding how the world came to be that we see, and understanding why systems are in place, how they even got there, and how they impact us. Sometimes we think we've escaped some of it, and we look back, after listening to these kinds of workshops, we look back and we go, actually, when I was in 6th grade and I got left back twice, and I guess it was 7th grade for me, got left back twice, what was going on about, and it really gets you thinking. So I want to say thank you so much to both of you, especially you, Dr. Herriford, who bringing this information to the surface. And at this time now, it's very timely. It's an imperative. It's going to help us survive. So I want to thank Dr. Veronica Honeycutt for putting this workshop together, and Mary Rivers for kind of behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and Edgar, I don't see where you are. Edgar Palacios is behind the scenes helping us with the technology here. And I just want to read off everybody's information. We've got Dr. Veronica Honeycutt, the CEO of the Honeycutt Foundation, Mary Rivers, who's with the Honeycutt Foundation, helping with the administration, Dr. Joe Kent, who had facilitated this meeting and moderated, myself, who have assisted, and of course, Dr. Edgar Palacios. And I want to please make sure that you put a little bookmark in your calendar for August 27th for our next one, for our next presentation. And the comments in the survey and both tonight will help us develop what the subject matter will be for the next meeting. So I want to thank you for that. And I think we're going to hear from Stephanie Woodford again. Is that correct, Dr. Honeycutt or Mary?
Yes, it is. As we close out, thank you all for being with us today. What a great evening. Dr. Joe and Dr. O, you're the best. Okay? Excellent. It gave us a lot of food for thought. Thank you for being present. Yes, this is Stephanie, one of my mentees, jazz and pop musician, singer and composer, graduate of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, Preparatory to Music, and St. Ignatius College, Preparatory High School. Graduate in music from, yes, City College of San Francisco. While she was in high school, she released her big band song, Keep It Moving, the only student in the history of St. Ignatius to have an original composition performed by the jazz band. And she's been selected for one honor after another. This is a young woman raised by her daddy, Mr. Stephen Woodford, a wonderful man. Okay, don't tell me what men can't do. They can raise. Don't start me. Okay? Listen, I love you all. God bless you. Have a great weekend. Don't forget about our next forum, as Thor pointed out, August 27th, 6 to 8. It'll be a surprise what that subject will be, but it'll be something provocative and something you probably have been wondering about. As I said, we look forward to seeing you. Have a wonderful evening and take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Honeycutt. Wonderful, wonderful job.
Oh, thank you.
All of you. I'm just so impressed. I'm so glad I could come aboard.
Thank you, Dr. Carolyn, for being with us. You're wonderful.
My joy and pleasure. Oh my God. Yes, wonderful. Dr. O was great. I just, and Dr. Canton, oh my Lord. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Take care. I hope we have a repeat of this topic again.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Night.
Good night now.
I can't see me. I can't see me. No. I can't see me. What about my education? I can't see me. Oh no. Yeah. I can't see me.